a lot of the innovation here actually creates markets. So it doesn't, take other people's pieces of the pie. It makes the whole pie bigger.
Hi, I'm Dana Yao, your host on the Emerging Markets Tech Startups podcast. While traveling to over 90 countries, I was inspired by the entrepreneurial spirit across startup communities in Africa, Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. On the show, we bring you stories from entrepreneurs, startup ecosystem innovators, and investors. We discuss what makes these markets culturally and historically unique, local trends, local challenges consumers and founders face, and the opportunities. Let's get started. We're so lucky to have Marcelo on the show today. Marcelo leads expansion for Yoco, which is the Square of Africa. He moved to South Africa 6 years ago from Europe. In this episode, we dive into a fascinating conversation about the payments landscape in South Africa and across the continent, the influence of apartheid, and how payments will be the backbone to enable even more entrepreneurship on the continent. I am so psyched to introduce my friend Marcelo, who apparently we just counted and have known each other for 8 years. You're one of my oldest friends from this global community, so I'm excited to welcome you on the show, Marcelo. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Hey, Diana, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, and it's definitely been quite a while, so it's exciting to be able to chat again. I'm Marcello. I'm originally half Austrian, half Italian, but I've been living in South Africa for the past 6 years, and really working across the startup space on the continent. I've basically held two different roles. So for the first 2.5, 3 years of my time working across the continent, I've worked for a company called SeedStars, where I was the regional manager for Africa. And I was essentially visiting and traveling through about 20 or so startup ecosystems all across the continent to find the best startups, train them, mentor them, support them, connect them with partners, and also just connect the ecosystems between each other, which has been a really beautiful experience. And now for the past 3 years, I've moved into the startup space myself. And I've joined the South African fintech company called Yoco, where I am the head of international expansion. And we are basically in the business of helping small businesses accept digital payments more easily. And we're currently helping over 90,000 businesses in South Africa accept digital payments. And my role is essentially to understand how we can extend that service to companies, not just in South Africa, but in other countries on the continent and the world.
So there must be a reason why you've stayed there for so long. So can you tell me about, I guess even from an outsider point of view, some of the things about the market that has fascinated you?
That opportunity to be part of a environment that's fast growing, that's changing fast, and where there's so much opportunity to have an impact. That's something that's been really, really fascinating to me. So that combination of fast growth, of lots of opportunity for innovation, I think that's something that really excites me.
And let's double click on that, because a lot of people can say those exact things about, well, they would, about Silicon Valley. Things are happening, a lot of high growth. So how does the growth you're seeing in Africa differentiate from what people would see growth in Silicon Valley?
The ecosystem in Silicon Valley is generally much more based on the higher levels of Maslow's pyramid, where people are basically trying to invent the future. How do we build electric cars, or how do we build this, or how do we build that? Or it's almost very niche, right? So how do we build the best B2B lead generation SaaS platform for the medical space? Which it's beautiful stuff and really important, and we've seen it generate a lot of value. What I think you see on the continent is that the innovation is much more broad, and much more applicable to bigger part of the economies, right? People are trying to solve traffic problems, transport problems, health problems, education problems, access to finance problems, access to technology problems. So the innovation here is much more around kind of enabling the economy on a broader scale, and driving the economy on a broader scale. Whereas in Silicon Valley, it's it's happening very much at the kind of edges or the niches of the economy.
What do you think are three local problems and opportunities? You talked about some of them.
The big problems that are still to solve are um, employment, healthcare, and education. And maybe you can add financial inclusion to that as well, even though that's a bit of a complicated one to unpack. I think, South Africa specifically has a massive unemployment problem. We have about a 55% youth unemployment rate. And now in with COVID, I think we've had another 3 million additional unemployed people on a population of 55 million people. That essentially pushes unemployment of the entire population close to the 50%. So creating jobs for people and empowering people to create jobs for themselves is super important. Healthcare is really important. Especially in South Africa, if you can afford it, you can get world-class healthcare. For example, the first heart transplant that was ever done anywhere in the world was done in South Africa. So that gives you a sense of how good the healthcare system here is. But at the same time, if you don't have the money to afford it, then your outlook looks very different. And the same kind of dynamic is true for education, where if you have money to pay for schools, you find some of the best schools on the continent, and even competitive with big schools all around the world. You find them in South Africa. But if you cannot afford going into these schools, then your outlooks in terms of education look very different. So I think those are really the three big problems that need to be solved.
And that's a great segue to talk more about Is that how you pronounce it? Yoco?
It's Yoco, exactly.
Okay. Because I'm assuming you guys are helping to make impact in the financial inclusion space. So, what problem is your company solving in this market?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So we are in the business of helping businesses accept digital payments. Very similar to, I think, what a lot of viewers, listeners would know, a company like Square in the US, where we're really about essentially financial inclusion for small businesses. So what's interesting in South Africa is that financial inclusion on the consumer level has been really successful. So about 90% of South Africans have bank accounts. They have cards that they use with the bank accounts. But on the merchant side, only about 6% of small businesses are able to accept these digital payments. If your customers want to pay with card and you cannot accept it, you will lose business, you will lose sale, and it just affects the chances of you being able to grow your business. And so we really trying to solve the issue of financial inclusion for merchants and small businesses, and creating access to them for financial services essentially. South Africa has a very concentrated banking space, so there's only about 4 or 5 big banks really, and that's on a population of 55 million people. And what that has led to, even more so than in other countries, is a bit of a culture of exclusion. So banks kind of banks have become fairly expensive and fairly exclusionary in terms of who they want to do business with, who they want to deal with, and they have implicitly accepted that if they raise prices and only serve a small part of the market very profitably, they think they're better off than serving the long tail and serving the majority of the market. And so that has just created a massive opportunity to serve that long tail and to help that long tail and play in a space where the banks don't even want to play. And so I think that's something we're very proud of, is that those 90,000 businesses that have signed up for Yoco, about 75% of them have never accepted card payments before. So we're not going and saying we're offering a better product to the bank than the bank, which we do. But what we're saying is, we're going to the people that don't have access and give them access. And so that's creating an entirely new market.
Brazil has a similar challenge, and they had a bank called Nubank come into the stage a couple of years ago. I was reading an interview with the founder, and they asked him, "Aren't you scared that you're threatening the other banks? And how are you going to compete?" He was like, when the problems in a country and the banking system is so bad, we only have to be a bit better to be competitive. So it sounds like the same thing here. The existing banking infrastructure isn't providing, like you said, for the long tail, and you guys are serving the underserved.
And I think that speaks a little bit to the point I was mentioning earlier around how much there still is to build. Whereas I think in developed countries, you you often have to take other people's market share to grow, because the market is essentially saturated, right? In the US, everybody has a bank account, and probably multiple bank accounts. So if you want to grow your digital bank, you essentially have to churn people from other banks, or be happy to be the second or third or fourth or fifth bank account. Whereas on the continent, what you see often is that you a lot of the innovation here actually creates markets. So it doesn't take other people's pieces of the pie. It makes the whole pie bigger. And I think that's a really exciting way to grow a business, because it's you're essentially creating value in the economy instead of just shifting it from A to B.
I so love that you call that out. Because going to what you said earlier, why is operating in the African continent so exciting? Like you said, saying it's generating new markets completely from scratch. You're able to grow extremely fast. So I think you just called out that very concrete example of what you mean by growing fast versus some other economies. So I'm curious, are these smaller businesses or small medium businesses that you're targeting, are they all over this, or do you find a bunch of them resistant because they don't understand the financial space?
The way we think about it is there's essentially different stages of the market at which you will appeal to different people. At the beginning, our product was very much taken on by early adopters. So people who love technology, who love to have the newest stuff all the time. And then I think as we've grown, we've kind of moved into the early majority, and now we're kind of slowly starting to move into the mass market. um, and that's a really beautiful place to be, because that's really where the majority of the population is. But there's always going to be people that might be a bit hesitant, or might have reasons not to want to use technology for their business. And that's okay. We're the market is big enough that even if we only get a fraction of the market, I think we would have still done a really important service to the business ecosystem.
For consumers, the convenience, right? If 90% of them have a credit card and they can't use it in most places, it's kind of useless. So this is amazing. And if we think bigger picture, what are some of the milestones you've seen in the payment space across the continent or in South Africa?
What's been happening here is the focus in a lot of the countries has been on financial inclusion of the consumer. And one of the very powerful tools to get there, in many markets, has been mobile money. And I'm not sure if people are familiar with mobile money, but it's essentially you can think of it as almost like as a bank account linked to your SIM card and your phone number. That is, essentially comes with your SIM, and allows you to send money from phone to phone, without needing data, without needing apps. It's almost like what in the US is Venmo, but essentially it works on even a feature phone, and it's offered by the telcos and doesn't require a bank account. So that's one of the things that's been coming up across the continent, for the past 10, 15 years, and has contributed massively to financial inclusion, because it now allows people, even if they don't qualify for bank accounts, or they think bank accounts are too expensive, to be able to send money across the country, now even more so across borders as well, but also kind of have a basic digital account that they can use for a lot of things.
Who or which company has kickstarted that wave?
Yeah, so the most famous example is M-Pesa in Kenya, which is the mobile money service launched by Safaricom, which is owned by the Vodafone Group, sorry. And essentially all the other telcos have also started offering these services. So MTN, which has the largest footprint on the continent, I think has over 100 million mobile money subscribers. Vodafone offers M-Pesa in most of their markets. Airtel has Airtel Money. So like all the big telcos have done that. So that isn't necessarily a startup story. It's a very successful, almost like corporate venturing story. What's been interesting from a startup perspective, though, is all the things that have started to be built on top of these mobile money platforms. So now you start seeing companies that are building interoperability between these wallets. So now the problem is that if you have an MTN account and I have a Vodafone account, M-Pesa account, sometimes even in the same country, we cannot send money to each other. And it's even harder across borders. And so now you're seeing companies that have started to build these interoperability platforms so that people can send money to each other, independent of borders, independent of bank accounts. You've started.
Are the banks building these, or what are some example startups?
No, so these are startups. So there's companies like MFS Africa, for example, that has focused specifically on remittances. So they've built a massive platform to essentially make these different wallets interoperable across borders. And then there's other companies that have kind of focused on facilitating payments through mobile money platforms. So be it payment of electricities or school fees or merchants. And so there's companies like Bionic in East Africa that's actually just been acquired, that's done a really interesting job there. And so yeah, I think the second wave of this mobile money revolution has really been all the startups that have been able to build interesting services on top of that and get to an interesting level of scale.
Payments is such a core part of infrastructure, and another entrepreneur I spoke to in Nigeria was saying payments opens up the door to new markets. So can you give specific examples where it's completely transformed industries?
A lot of innovation is going to rely on people paying for it, right? You can build the best health application or telemedicine application. You can build the best online school. You can build the best online platform. But if people struggle to pay you, it's going to be very hard to scale it up. So the more friction there is in payments, the more complicated it is to do commerce. The more complicated it is to do commerce, the harder it is to scale a business. And I think we're seeing this across a lot of different environments. And maybe one of the examples that could be quite interesting for people is actually Uber in Kenya. So when Uber launched in Kenya, it looked very similar to how Uber in the US. So you just hop in, you have a card linked in your back, and you leave the car, and then you pay. But what they found very quickly was that a significant amount of people didn't have cards to link to their accounts, and a significant amount of drivers didn't have bank accounts to get the money paid into. And so they worked at launching and integrating M-Pesa into Uber so that people could essentially pay the Uber drivers using mobile money, and they could receive mobile money into their accounts. And I don't know the exact numbers, but that M-Pesa payments channel became one of the biggest channels in a very short period of time because it was just so well adjusted to the local environment and how people wanted to pay and receive money. So I think these are some of the examples where you see how, some of that integration into the right payments infrastructure then unlocks business growth for you because you make it easier for people to pay.
Those are really good examples. How has laying out the payment infrastructure tackled inequality? So first, talk a bit about the problem in South Africa, and two, if you have any examples, how it's made things maybe more equal, like enabling entrepreneurship, enabling businesses.
In South Africa, a lot of, with COVID, we've seen lots of companies closing. We've seen lots of businesses shutting down. And as a result of that, lots of people losing their jobs. and now being in a position where they might not want to or might not be able to find a new job quickly, and so they kind of go into entrepreneurship. So we're seeing lots of these. I mean, it's been coming for a long time, but it's even been accelerated now. We're seeing a lot of these almost like sole proprietor businesses coming up that kind of offer cleaning services, or start an ice cream business, or start a meat shop, like really, really small businesses. And the problem in the past was that these businesses would just be insignificantly small for a bank, and so a bank wouldn't care about servicing them, because they'd rather spend their time servicing big customers that give them a lot of money, rather than small customers that are not going to make them a lot of money, and they're probably going to cause them headaches. At least that's what they think. And what we're seeing now is we're starting to see a big uptake in businesses like this signing up on our platform, because we want to help anyone, right? Especially when you're starting out, you want all the help you can get, and making it easy to get paid is one of the biggest, most important things here. So we're really seeing how making payments technology accessible for people can become really transformational, especially during a time like this of COVID, where a lot of people are already in a precarious situation, are taking the leap to start a business, and especially at this point, you want them to get all the help they can get, and so that's one of the things we're trying to push for.
Wow. So I'm hearing payments infrastructure enables smaller players to create their own business, but also importantly, grow that business. And this helps tackle the inequality problem, because back then it would have stayed status quo, because the banks wouldn't have offered them loans, and they wouldn't have given them access to an account to put savings in, etc. That's an amazing story. Do you want to talk a little bit about the inequality problem? I know we talked about it before the call, and I was pretty fascinated on how that stems from the history of South Africa and apartheid. I think that would be really fascinating for the listeners.
Basically up until 25 years ago, South Africa had an apartheid regime that essentially codified the segregation of the white and the black population, and systematically excluded the black population from economic opportunities, and that fortunately ended 25 years ago, at least in law. But we're still seeing a lot of the carryover of that system manifest in different ways today. As a starter, South Africa is, as a fact, the most unequal society in the world. So you have the highest Gini coefficient, which essentially measures inequality. And even though I think about 6 or 7% of the population is white, and the rest is black, you have, I think, about 2/3 or even a little bit more of the wealth sitting in white hands. If you look at most leaders in the corporate world and most management levels in the corporate world, you see a predominant representation of white and white males more often than not, which is
what's new.
but that part isn't too different from other parts of the world. Where in South Africa, it's just particularly crazy because that population makes up a vast minority of the overall population. And so, and then the other thing you had was, during apartheid, they also had spatial segregation of populations. So a lot of white people were essentially given massive plots of land on which they could build massive houses. And then a lot of the black population was essentially put into what's called townships, which is literally segregated areas where they would live, and then travel into the white areas where they would go for their jobs or go for their employment. And a lot of that, and because that was physical segregation, these are things you cannot change easily over time. And so a lot of that still exists. So you can have areas where you have beautiful mansions, and then literally a kilometer away, but hidden, you'd have townships with aluminum shacks, where people live in sometimes super precarious conditions. So you have a lot of that inequality. You have a lot of the economic inequality, and that has led the government to take some quite drastic action in the country, in a good way, where they've introduced a system called BEE, or Black Economic Empowerment, which is essentially almost a rating system for companies that qualifies them based on how much employment, equity, and procurement they do with uh, Black-owned businesses or Black people. So essentially, the more your company is owned by Black South Africans, the more you employ Black South Africans, but also the more you procure um, products and services from other Black-owned companies, that essentially gives your business points, and that puts your business up in terms of certain levels, which then again gives you access to more business opportunities and more and more opportunities in the private sector, but also in the public sector. So it's a really interesting incentive scheme to redistribute wealth on a massive scale, which is something that's super important and absolutely necessary in the country. But it creates a couple. It's very unique to South Africa, and I think people haven't really heard of things like that before.
We in the States need to copy that ASAP, especially in these times. So I want to transition
Yeah.
a bit. The last part is to understand the startup ecosystem, especially your work back in SeedStars. So let's first understand the question: what are the top three most successful local startups and their products? They can be outside of the payment space.
One company that I personally like a lot is a company called InterSwitch, which isn't necessarily a startup anymore. I mean, I think they're about 15 years old now, but they've basically built one of the most interesting financial services businesses in Nigeria, and expanded to a bunch of other countries as well. There's a company I really like called Safe Border, and there's similar companies around the continent as well. But essentially, they're using the motorbike taxis that are very common across a lot of African countries, and putting them into a service similar to Uber, where you can basically hail them digitally. And then another company I really like is a company called Kobo 360, which is a Nigerian company that essentially is trying to make road freight more effective. And so they're building a model where they can essentially help truck owners and truck drivers fill their trucks more efficiently, avoid empty trips, and essentially help them utilize their assets better. Which is also a really interesting problem, especially in the African context, where you have a lot of countries that are landlocked, and so a lot of countries rely essentially, uh, you know, essentially completely relying on um, on road freight to function.
And I love these are examples of solving local problems that are very specific. Are there any other startups you think that might not be scaled at the size of InterSwitch, SafeBoda, but are still interesting business models?
A company called Aerobotics. They basically using drones to survey large areas in the agriculture space, and essentially use that to detect, if there's any problems, if any specific attention is needed in specific parts of your fields, but then can also be used for insurance claims and stuff like that. So it's a really interesting company using drone technology in the agriculture space.
The listeners are always curious about businesses specifically down on the ground, how they're operating. It's always very unique. And I always say that nowadays we in the US should be copying from emerging markets. For example, like to talk about the ride hailing or ride sharing innovation, where Lyft was inspired by seeing it in Zimbabwe first, right? So I think that's continually going to be a trend. So let's talk a little bit about the startup ecosystem this last section. When you were at SeedStars, what were maybe three key challenges you saw in the startup ecosystem space?
I would say the first challenge that is probably unique to many startups on the continent is, I guess, the basic infrastructure challenges. I remember speaking to a CEO a while back who was telling me that he probably spends a third of his time running to buy fuel for his generator because his landlord only pays for generators from 9 to 5, and if they want to work longer, then they have to procure their own fuel for the generator. So like you have to spend a significant amount of your time solving infrastructure problems of like, what's a good office space, where do we get electricity, all of these things, which is something that and the internet access. Then you have countries where internet gets cut out regularly, or it's just very unreliable, and so you're already fighting basic infrastructure challenges that take a massive amount of time and also cost a lot of money to solve, that somebody working in San Francisco doesn't even have to think about. I think the second thing that a lot of businesses on the continent struggle is that despite the continent being big, so Africa has 1.2 billion people. You have 55 different countries. Despite all of that, the individual market sizes are actually very small. So it's really hard to build a big business by relying on just your domestic market. So you almost have to think about, how do you expand outside of your home country from day one, which also has a lot of challenges, of course. And then the third thing that a lot of people struggle with often is just funding. So because the continent itself is not very much on the radar of investors yet, and because of some of these challenges, entrepreneurs on the continent are often at a significant disadvantage when it comes to fundraising, and I think that's shown in the funding numbers that the continent gets. Right, if you look at some of the stats, I think last year all the startups on the continent together raised about $1.2 billion, if I remember my numbers right. And if you think about that in a Silicon Valley context, that's probably funding that's raised in any given week in Silicon Valley. And so yeah, I think with that, you're at a significant disadvantage. The flip side of this, though, is that companies that come from the continent and have reached a certain amount of scale tend to be significantly more resilient, and significantly more kind of inventive in terms of how to solve business challenges than many companies in other parts of the world. So I think that's a little bit of the silver lining here, is that if you can overcome these challenges, you build a business that's so much more resilient and so much more just kind of capable of withstanding challenges than businesses in many other parts of the world.
My episode with Kola, who's from Nigeria, he said, if people are able to live in Nigeria, or business able to operate in Nigeria, you can withstand any circumstance. So it resonates to what you're saying. So you've talked about the challenges, which is a great segue to the last question. How can people help? I think after this conversation, people are so inspired and see the opportunity, see the crazy growth that you talked about in the beginning. If they want to invest in this ecosystem, whether monetarily or with their time, what's the best way?
You need to be very open and curious. And I think you mentioned this earlier as well. I think we often have this idea in the quote unquote developed world that we need to export our knowledge and our insights and technology to Africa and to the developing world. And I think that's often a bit of a moral fallacy, because there's a lot of things we can actually learn from how things are running on the continent. So I think the most important thing is be open and curious, and really just kind of start learning and observing. Like start reading some of the tech blogs to get a sense for what are the conversations that are happening, for what's important. Start reading up on some companies and start getting a sense for, what problems are people solving and what's going on. And so kind of put in the learning first, and then figure out the best way to engage in an industry or environment that you're interested and excited about. But just don't come, thinking that just because you have 2 years of being in Silicon Valley, that all of a sudden you know everything, and the whole world is just waiting for your knowledge and insights. So I think, a little bit of humility and curiosity goes a very long way.
Yes, and I think a great source of that is listeners listening to you, who you've been in the ecosystem for 6 years and have lived through these experiences, so can speak to them. So that will save people some of the research when they have the condensed version. So thank you so much for sharing all these thoughts, your experiences, and yes.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for joining us today on the Emerging Markets Tech Startup Show. If you have questions, comments, requests for me to cover an emerging market, or want to be connected with today's guest, leave me a comment in the reviews or find me on Twitter @Diana Yao. Until next time,